Alright, it is time for the Trivia Minute, and here we go. Sir Powham Grenville Wodehouse, who lived from October 15th, 1881 to February 14th, 1975, was an English writer and one of the most widely read humorists of the 20th century. His creations include the feather-brained Bertie Wooster and his valet Jeeves, the immaculate P. P. Smith, Lord Ellsworth, and the Blandings Castle set, the oldest member, with stories about golf, and Mr. Milner, with tall tales on subjects ranging from bishops to melodramatic megalomaniac movie moguls. Born in Guildford, the third son of a British magistrate based in Hong Kong, Wodehouse spent happy teenage years at Dulwich College, to which he remained devoted all his life. After leaving school, he was employed by a bank but disliked the work and turned to writing in his spare time. His early novels were mostly school stories, but he later switched to comic fiction. Most of Wodehouse's fiction is set in his native United Kingdom, although he spent much of his life in the U.S. and used New York and Hollywood as settings for some of his novels and short stories. He wrote a series of Broadway musical comedies during and after the First World War, together with Guy Bolton and Jerome Kern, that played an important part in the development of the American musical. He began in the 1930s writing for MGM in Hollywood. In a 1931 interview, his naive revelations of incompetence and extravagance in the studio caused a furor. In the same decade, his literary career reached a new peak. In 1934, Wodehouse moved to France for tax reasons. In 1940, he was taken prisoner at Lortic by the invading Germans and interned for nearly a year. After his release, he made 5 broadcasts from German radio in Berlin to the U.S., which had not yet entered the war. These talks were comic and apolitical, but his broadcasts over enemy radio prompted anger and stringent controversy in Britain and a threat of prosecution. Wodehouse never returned to England. From 1947 until his death, he lived in the U.S. He took U.S. citizenship in 1955 while retaining his British one. He died in 1975 at the age of 93 in Southampton, New York, 1 month after he was awarded a knighthood of the Order of the British Empire, KB. Wodehouse was a prolific writer throughout his life, publishing more than 90 books, 40 plays, 200 short stories, and other writings between 1902 and 1974. He worked extensively on his books, sometimes having 2 or more in preparation simultaneously. He would take up to 2 years to build a plot and write a scenario of about 30,000 words. After the scenario was complete, he would write the story. Early in his career, Wodehouse would produce a novel in about 3 months, but he slowed in old age to around 6 months. He used a mixture of Edwardian slang, quotations from and allusions to numerous poets, and several literary techniques to produce a prose style that has been compared to comic poetry and musical comedy. Some critics of Wodehouse have considered his work flippant, but among his fans are former British prime ministers and many of his fellow writers, as well as your current host. He is my favorite writer of all time. Wodehouse was born in Guildford, Surrey, the third son of Henry Ernest Wodehouse, a magistrate resident in the British colony of Hong Kong, and his wife Eleanor, daughter of John Bathurst Dane. The Wodehouses belonged to a a cadet branch of the family of the Earls of Kimberley. Eleanor Wodehouse was also of ancient aristocratic ancestry. She was visiting her sister in Guildford when Wodehouse was born there prematurely. The boy was baptized at the Church of St. Nicholas, Guildford, and was named after his godfather, Palom von Donop. Wodehouse wrote in 1957, "If you ask me to tell you frankly if I like the name Palom Grenville Wodehouse, I must confess that I do not. I was named after a godfather, and not a thing to show for it but a small silver mug which I lost in 1897. The first name was rapidly shortened to Plum, the name by which Wodehouse became known to family and friends. Mother and son sailed for Hong Kong, where for the first 2 years Wodehouse was raised by a Chinese nurse alongside his elder brother Philip Perville John and his other brother Ernest Armine. When he was 2, the brothers were brought to England, where they were placed under the care of an English nanny in a house adjoining that of Eleanor's father and mother. The boy's parents returned to Hong Kong and became virtual strangers to their sons. Such an arrangement was then normal for middle-class families based in the colonies. The lack of parental contact and the harsh regime of some of those in loco parentis left permanent emotional scars on many children from similar backgrounds, including many writers. Wodehouse was more fortunate. His nanny, Emma Roper, was strict and not unkind, and both with her and later at his different schools, Wodehouse had a generally happy childhood. His recollection was that it went like a breeze from start to finish, with everybody I met understanding me perfectly. The biographer, Robert McCrum, suggests that nevertheless Wodehouse's isolation from his parents left a psychological mark, causing him to avoid emotional engagement both in life and in his work. Although biographer Francis Donaldson writes, deprived so early, not merely of maternal love, but of home life and even a stable background, Wodehouse consoled himself from the youngest age in an imaginary world of his own. In 1886, the brothers were sent to a dame school in Croydon, where they spent 3 years. Perville was then found to have a weak chest. Sea air was prescribed, and the 3 boys were moved to Elizabeth College on the island of Grosvenor. In 1891, Wodehouse went to Malvern House Preparatory School in Kent, which concentrated on preparing its pupils for entry to the Royal Navy. His father had planned a naval career for him, but the boy's eyesight was found to be too poor for that. He was unimpressed by the school's narrow curriculum and zealous discipline. He later parodied it in his novels, with Bertie Wooster recalling his early years as a pupil at the same school with the outright guise of a prep school. With the outward guise of a prep school called Malvern House. Chaney Court, Dettridge, a large 17th century house near Box in Wiltshire, was one of Wodehouse's homes while his parents were living in Hong Kong. His grandmother died in 1892, after which he was largely brought up by his aunts, including the writer Mary Bathurst Dean, the original Bertie Wooster, the original of Bertie Wooster's fictional Aunt Agatha. In 1955, Wodehouse wrote, "Aunt Agatha is definitely my Aunt Mary, who was the scourge of my childhood." Throughout their school years, the brothers were sent to stay during the holidays with various uncles and aunts from both sides of the family. In the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Lane's Brote counts 20 aunts and considers that they played an important part not only in Wodehouse's early life, but thinly disguised in his mature novels as the formidable aunts who dominate the actions in the Worcester, Blandings, and other stories. The boy had 15 uncles, 4 of whom were clergymen. Sprout writes that they inspired Wodehouse's pious but fallible curates, vicars, and bishops, of which he wrote with friendly irreverence but without mockery. At the age of 12, in 1894, to his great joy, Wodehouse was able to follow his brother Armane to Dulwich College. He was entirely at home there. Donaldson comments that Dulwich gave him, for the first time, some continuity and a stable and ordered life. He loved the camaraderie, distinguished himself at cricket, rugby, and boxing, and was a good, if not consistently diligent student. The headmaster at the time was A.H. Gilkes, a respected classicalist who had a strong influence on Wodehouse. In a study of Wodehouse's work, Richard Usborne argues that only a writer who was himself a scholar and had his face ground into Latin and Greek as a boy could sustain the complex sequence of subordinate clauses sometimes found in Wodehouse's comic prose. Wodehouse's 6 years at Dulwich were among the happiest of his life. To me, the years between 1894 and 1900 were like heaven, he later wrote. In addition to his sporting achievements, he was a good singer and enjoyed taking part in school concerts. His literary leanings found an outlet in editing the school magazine, The Alien Name. For the rest of his life, he remained devoted to the school. The biographer Barry Phelps writes that Wodehouse loved the college as much as he loved anything or anybody. Wodehouse expected to follow Armane to the University of Oxford, but the family's finances took a turn for the worst at the critical moment. Ernest Wodehouse had retired in 1895 and his pension was paid in rupees. Fluctuations against the pounds reduced its value in Britain. Wodehouse recalled, "The wolf was not actually whining at the door, but there was always a little something in the kitty for the butcher and the grocer, and there was always a little something in the kitty for the butcher and the grocer, but the finances would not run to anything in the nature of a splash." Instead of a university career, in September 1900, Wodehouse was engaged in a junior position in the London office of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. He was unsuited to it and found the work baffling and uncongenial. He later wrote a humorous account of his experiences at the bank, but at the time he longed for the end of each working day when he could return to his rented lodgings in Chelsea and write. At first he concentrated with some success on serious articles about school sports for the public school magazine. In November 1900, his first comic piece, Men Who Missed Their Own Weddings, was accepted by Titbits, a new magazine for boys. The captain provided further well-paid opportunities. During his 2 years at the bank, Wodehouse had 80 pieces published in a total of 9 magazines. In 1901, with the help of his former Dulwich master, William Beach Thomas, Wodehouse secured an appointment, at first temporary and later permanent, writing for the Globe's popular By the Way column. He held the post until 1909. At around the same time, his first novel was published, a school story called The Pot Hunters. Serialized incomplete in the public school magazine in early 1902 and issued in full in hardback in September, he resigned from the bank that month to devote himself to writing full time. Between the publication of Pot Hunters in 1902 and that of Mike in 1909, Wodehouse wrote 8 novels and co-wrote another 2. The critic R.D.B. French writes that of Wodehouse's work from this period, almost all that deserves to survive is the school fiction. Looking back in the 1950s, Wodehouse viewed these as his apprentice years. I was practically in swaddling clothes, and it is extremely credible to me that I was able to write at all. From his boyhood, Wodehouse had been fascinated by America, which he considered as a land of romance, and he yearned to visit the country, and by 1904 he had earned enough to do so. In April, he sailed to New York, which he found greatly to his liking. He noted in his diary, in New York, gathering experience worth many guineas in the future, but none for the moment. The prediction proved correct. Few British writers had first-hand experience of the U.S., and his articles about life in New York brought him higher than usual fees. He later recalled that in 1904, anyone in London writing in the London writing world who had been to America was regarded with awe and looked upon as an authority on that terra incognita. After that trip to New York, I was a man who counted. My income rose like a rocketing pheasant. Wodehouse's other new venture in 1904 was writing for the stage. Towards the end of the year, the librettist Owen Hall invited him to contribute additional lyric for a musical comedy, Sergeant Brew. Wodehouse had loved theater since his first visit, age 13, when Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience had made him drunk with ecstasy. His lyrics for Hall, Put Me in My Little Cell, was a Gilbertian number for a trio of comic crooks, with music by Frederick Rose. It was well received and launched Wodehouse on a career as a theater writer that spanned 3 decades. Although it made little impact on its first publication, in 1906, the 1906 novel Love Among the Chickens contained what French called the author's first original comic creation. Stanley Furnistow Ukebridge, the character, an amoral, bungling opportunist, is partly based on Wodehouse's Globe colleague, Herbert Westbrook. The two collaborated between 1907 and 1913 on 2 books, 2 musical sketches, and a play, Brother Alfred. Wodehouse would return to the character in short stories over the next 6 decades. In early 1906, the actor-manager Seymour Hicks invited Wodehouse to become a resident lyricist at the Aldwych Theatre, to add typical topical verses to newly imported or long-running shows. Hicks had already recruited the young Jerome Kern to write the music for such songs. The first Kern-Wodehouse collaboration, a comic number for the Beauty of the Bath entitled Mr. Joseph Chamberlain, was a showstopper and was briefly the most popular song in London. Wodehouse's early period as a writer came to an end in 1908 with the serialization of The Lost Lambs, published the following year in book form as the second half of the novel Mike. The work begins as a conventional school story, but Wodehouse introduces a new striking original character, P. Smith, whose creation both Evelyn Waugh and George Orwell regarded as a watershed in Wodehouse's development. Wodehouse said that he based P. Smith on impresario Rupert d'Orly Carte. The only thing in my literary career which was handed to me on a silver plate was with watercrests around it. Wodehouse wrote in the 1970s that a cousin of his who had been at school with Carte told him of the latter's monocle, studied suavity, and the stateliness of speech, all of which Wodehouse adopted for his new character. P. Smith featured in 3 more novels: P. Smith in the City, 1910, A Burlesque of Banking, P. Smith Journalist, 1915, set in New York, and Leave It to P. Smith in 1923, set at Blandings Castle. In May 1909, Wodehouse made his second visit to New York, where he sold 2 short stories to Cosmopolitan and Collier's for a total of $500, a much higher fee than he had commanded previously. He resigned from the Globe and stayed in New York for nearly a year. He sold many more stories, but none of the American publications offered a permanent relationship and guaranteed income. Wodehouse returned to England in late 1910, rejoining the Globe and also contributing regularly to the Strand magazine. So my 2 favorite writers both wrote for the Strand magazine. Interesting. Between then and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he revisited America frequently. Wodehouse was in New York when the war began. Ineligible for military service because of his poor eyesight, he remained in the U.S. throughout the war, detached from the conflict in Europe, and absorbed in his theatrical and literary concerns. In September 1914, he married Ethel May Wyman, née Newton, an English widow. The marriage proved happy and lifelong. Ethel's personality was in contrast with her husband's, and she was shy and impractical. He was gregarious, decisive, and well organized. In Sprout's phrase, she took charge of Wodehouse's life and made certain that he had the peace and quiet he needed to write. There were no children of the marriage, but Wodehouse came to love Ethel's daughter, Lenoria, and legally adopted her. Wodehouse experimented with different genres of fiction in these years. P. Smith Journalist, mixing comedy with social comment on slum landlords and racketeers, was published in 1915. The same year, the Saturday Evening Post paid $3,500 to serialize something new, the first of what became a series of novels set at Blandings Castle. It was published in hardback in the U.S. and in the U.K. in the same year, the British edition being retitled Something Fresh. It was Wodehouse's first farcical novel. It was also his first bestseller, and although his latter books included some gentler, lighter, satirical, sentimental elements, it was as farcier that he became known. Later that same year, Extricating Young Gussie, the first story about Bertie and Jeeves, was published. These stories introduced 2 sets of characters whom Wodehouse wrote for the rest of his life. The Blandings Castle series, set in England in an English stately home, depicted the attempts of a placid Lord Elmsworth to evade the many distractions around him, which included successive pairs of young lovers, the machinations of his exuberant brother Galahad, and the demands of his domineering sisters and super-efficient secretaries, and anything detrimental to his prize Sal, the Empress of Blandings. Bertie and Jeeves stories featured an amiable young man about town, regularly rescued from the consequences of his idiocy by the interference of his valet, Jeeves. A third milestone in Wodehouse's life came towards the end of 1915. His old songwriting partner, Jerome Kern, introduced him to writer Guy Bolton, who became Wodehouse's closest friend and a regular collaborator. Bolton and Kern had a musical, Very Good Eddie, running at the Princess Theater in New York. The show was successful, but they thought the song lyrics weak and invited Wodehouse to join them on its successor. This was Miss Springtime 1916, which ran for 227 performances, a good run by the standards of the day. The team produced several more successes, including Leave It to Jane, 1917, Oh Boy, 1917 through 1918, and Oh Lady Lady, 1918. And Wodehouse and Bolton wrote a few more shows with other composers. In these musicals, Wodehouse's lyrics won high praise from critics as well as fellow lyricists such as Ira Gershwin. Unlike his original model, Gilbert, Wodehouse preferred the music to be written first, fitting his words to the melodies. Donaldson suggests that this is the reason why his lyrics have largely been overlooked in recent years. They fit the music perfectly, but do not stand on their own in verse, as Gilbert's do. Nevertheless, Donaldson adds, the book and lyrics for the Princess Theater shows made the contributors an enormous fortune and played an important part in the development of the American musical. In the Grove Dictionary of American Music, Larry Stample writes, by presenting naturalistic stories and characters and attempting to integrate the songs and lyrics into the actions of the libretto, these works brought a new level of intimacy, cohesion, and sophistication to American musical comedy. The theater writer Gerald Boardman called Wodehouse the most observant, literate, and witty lyricist of his day. The composer Richard Rodgers wrote, before Larry Hart, only P.G. Wodehouse had made any real assault on the intelligence of the song-listening public. In the years after war, Wodehouse steadily increased his sales, polishing his existing characters and introducing new ones. Bertie and Jeeves, Lord Zelmsworth and his circle, Eucridge appeared in novels and short stories. P. Smith made his fourth and last appearance. Two new characters were the oldest member, narrating his series of golfing stories, and Mr. Molnar, telling his perpetually tall tales to fellow patrons of the bar at the Angler's Rest. Various other young men about town appeared in short stories about members of the Drones Club. The Wodehouses returned to England, where they had a house in London for some years, but Wodehouse continued to cross the Atlantic frequently, spending substantial periods in New York. He continued to work in the theater. During the 1920s, he collaborated on 9 musical comedies produced on Broadway or the West End, including the long-running Sally, 1920, Cabaret Girl, 1922, Rosalie, 1928. He also wrote non-musical plays, including the plays The Thing in 1926, adapted from Fenwick Molnar, and A Damsel in Distress, a dramatization of his 1919 novel. Although never a naturally gregarious man, Wodehouse was more sociable in the 1920s than at any other period. Donaldson lists among those whom he was on friendly terms with, including A. Milne, Ian Hay, Frederick Lonsdale, E. Phillips Oppenheim, and stage performers including George Grossmith Jr., Heather Thatcher, and Dorothy Dickens. There have been films of Wodehouse's stories since 1915, when A Gentleman of Leisure was based on his 1910 novel of the same name. Further screen adaptations of his books were made between then and 1927, but it was not until 1929 that Wodehouse went to Hollywood, where Bolton was working as a highly paid writer for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Ethel was taken with both the financial and social aspects of Hollywood life, and she negotiated a contract with MGM on her husband's behalf, under which he would be paid $2,000 a week. This large salary was particularly welcome because the couple had lost considerable sums in the Wall Street crash of 1929. The contract started in May 1930, but the studio found little for Wodehouse to do, and he had spare time to write a novel and 9 short stories. He commented, "It's odd how soon one comes to look on every minute as wasted that is given to earning one's salary." Even when the studio found a project for him to work on, the interventions of committees and constant rewriting by numerous contract offers meant that his ideas were rarely used. In a 2005 study of Wodehouse in Hollywood, Brian Taves wrote that Those Free French Girls, 1930, was as close to a success as Wodehouse was to have at MGM. His only other credits were minimal, and the other projects he worked on were not produced. Wodehouse's contract ended after a year and was not renewed. At MGM's request, he gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times. Wodehouse was described by Herbert Warren Wind as politically naive and fundamentally unworldly. And he caused a sensation by saying publicly that he had already told his friends privately about Hollywood's inefficiency, arbitrary decision-making, and waste of expensive talent. The interview was reprinted in the New York Times, and there was much editorial comment about the state of the film industry. Many writers had considered that the interview predicated a radical overhaul of the studio system, but Traves believed that it had been a storm in a teacup, and Donaldson commented that in the straightened post-crash era, the reforms would have been inevitable. Wynn's view of Wodehouse's naivete is not universally held. Biographers including Donaldson, McComb, and Phillips suggest that his unworldliness was only part of a complex character, and that in some respects he was highly astute. He was unsparing of the studio owners in his early 1930s short stories set in Hollywood, which contained what Taves considers Wodehouse's sharpest and most biting satire. During the 1930s, Wodehouse's theatrical work tailed off. He wrote or adapted 4 plays for the West End: Leave It to P. Smith, 1930, which he adapted in collaboration with Ian Hay, was the only one to have a long run. The reviewers in the Manchester Guardian praised the play, but commented, "It is Mr. Wodehouse's own inimitable narrative comments and descriptions in his own person of the antics of his puppets that one misses. They cannot be got into a play, and they are at least half the fun of the novels." In 1934, Wodehouse collaborated with Bolton on the book for Cole Porter's Anything Goes. Porter wrote his own lyrics, but at the last minute, their version was almost entirely rewritten by others at the instigation of the producer, who disliked the original script. Their version was almost entire. Concentrating on writing novels and short stories, Wodehouse reached the peak of his productivity in this decade, averaging 2 books each year and grossing an annual £100,000. His practice of dividing his time between Britain and America caused Wodehouse difficulty with the tax authorities of both countries. Both the UK Inland Revenue and the US Internal Revenue Service sought to tax him as a resident. The matter was settled after lengthy negotiations, but the Wodehouses decided to change their residential status beyond doubt by moving to France, where they bought a house near La Tourte in the north. In 1935, Wodehouse created the last of his regular cast of principal characters, Lord Ickleham, otherwise known as Uncle Fred, who, in Osborne's word, leads the dance in 4 novels and a short story in a whirling dynamo of misrule. His other books from the decade include Righto Jeeves, which Donaldson judged his best work, Uncle Fred in the Springtime, which the writer Bernard Levins considers the best, and Blanding's Castle, which contains Lord Elmsworth and The Girlfriend, which Rudyard Kipling thought one of the most perfect short stories I have ever read. Other leading literary figures who admired Wodehouse were A.E. Housman, Max Beerbohm, and Hilnar Belloc. On the radio and imprint, Belloc called Wodehouse the best writer of our time and the best living writer of English, the head of my profession. Wodehouse regarded Belloc's plaudit as a gag to get a rise out of serious-minded authors whom he disliked. Wodehouse was never sure that his books had literary merit as well as popular appeal, and Donaldson suggests must have been overwhelmed when the University of Oxford conferred an honorary doctorate of letters on him in June 1939. His visit to England for the award ceremony was the last time he set foot on it in his native land. At the start of the Second World War, Wodehouse and his wife remained in their La Tourte house, where during the Phoney War he worked on Joy in the Morning. With the advance of the Germans, the nearby Royal Air Force Base withdrew. Wodehouse was offered the sole spare seat in one of the fighting aircraft, but he turned down the opportunity as it would have meant leaving behind Ethel and their dog. On May 21st, 1940, with German troops advancing through northern France, the Wodehouses decided to drive to Portugal and fly from there to the U.S. 2 miles from home, their car broke down, so they returned and borrowed a car from a neighbor. With the routes blocked with refugees, they returned home again. The Germans occupied La Tourte on May 22nd, 1940, and Wodehouse had to report to the authorities daily. After 2 months of occupation, the Germans interned all male enemy nationals under 60, and Wodehouse was sent to a former prison in Los, a suburb of Le, on July 21st. Ethel remained in La Tourte. The internees were placed 4 to a cell, each of which had been designed for 1 man. 1 bed was available per cell, which was made available to the eldest man, not Wodehouse, who slept on the granite floor. The prisoners were not kept long in Los before they were transported in cattle trucks to a former barracks in Laing, Belgium, which was run as a prison by the SS. After a week, the men were transferred to Hue in Laing province, where they were incarcerated in the local citadel. They remained there until September 1940, where they were transported to Tost in Upper Silesia, then Germany, now to Zuk in Poland. Wodehouse's family and friends had not had any news of his location after the fall of France, but an article from an Associated Press reporter who had visited Tost in December 1940 led to pressure on the German authorities to release the novelist. This included a petition from influential people in the U.S. Senator W. Warren Burger presented to the German ambassador. Although his captors refused to release him, Wodehouse was provided with a typewriter, and to pass the time he wrote Money in the Bank. Although his time in Throughout his time in Tulsa, he sent postcards to his U.S. literary agents asking for $5 to be sent to various people in Canada, mentioning his name. These were the families of Canadian prisoners of war, and the news from Wodehouse was the first indication that their sons were alive and well. Wodehouse risks severe punishment for the communications, but managed to evade the German censors. On June 21st, 1941, while he was in the middle of playing a game of cricket, Wodehouse received a visit from two members of the Gestapo. He was given 10 minutes to pack his things before he was taken to the Hotel Adlon, a top luxury hotel in Berlin. He stayed there at his own expense. Royalties from the German editions of his book had been put into a special frozen bank account at the outset of the war, and Wodehouse was permitted to draw upon this money he had earned while staying in Berlin. He was thus released from internment a few months before his 60th birthday, the age at which citizen internees were released by the Nazis. Shortly afterwards, Wodehouse was, in the words of Phelps, cleverly trapped into making 5 broadcasts to the U.S. via German radio with the Berlin-based correspondent of the Columbia Broadcasting System. The broadcast aired on June 28th, 8th, 9th, 23rd, and July 30th and August 6th were titled How to Be an Internee Without Previous Training, and comprised humorous anecdotes about Wodehouse's experience as a prisoner, including some gentle mocking of his captors. The German propaganda ministry arranged for the recordings to be broadcast to Britain in August, the day after Wodehouse recorded his final program. Ethel joined him in Berlin, having sold most of her jewelry to pay for the journey. The reaction in Britain to Wodehouse's broadcasts was hostile. He was reviled as a traitor, collaborator, Nazi propagandist, and a coward, although Phelps observes many of those who decried his actions had not heard the content of the programs. A front-page article in the Daily Mirror stated that Wodehouse lived luxuriously because Britain laughed with him, but when the laughter was out of his country's heart, he was not ready to share her sufferings. He hadn't the guts even to stick it out in the internment camp. In the House of Commons, Anthony Eaton, the Foreign Secretary, regretted Wodehouse's actions. Several libraries removed Wodehouse novels from their shelves. On July 15th, the journalist William Connor, under his pen name Cassandra, broadcast a postscript to the news program railing against Wodehouse. According to the Times, the broadcast provoked a storm of complaints from listeners all over the country. Wodehouse's biographer, Joseph Connolly, thinks the broadcast inaccurate, spiteful, and slanderous. Phelps called it probably the most the most vile attack on an individual ever heard on British radio. The broadcast was made at the direct instruction of Dus Cooper, the Minister of Information, who overruled strong protests made by the BBC against the decision to air the program. Numerous letters appeared in the British press, both supporting and criticizing Wodehouse. The letters page of the Daily Telegraph became a focus for censoring Wodehouse, including one from Wodehouse's friend A.A. Mill, a reply from fellow author Campton Mackenzie in defense of Wodehouse was not published because the editor claimed a lack of space. Most of those defending Wodehouse against accusations of disloyalty, including Sax Rohmer, Dorothy L. Slayers, and Gilbert Francu, conceded that he had acted stupidly. Some members of the public wrote to the newspaper to say that the full facts were not yet known and a fair judgment could not be made until they were. The management of the BBC, who considered Wodehouse's actions no worse than ill-advised, pointed out to Cooper that there was no evidence at that point whether Wodehouse had acted voluntarily or under compulsion. When Wodehouse heard of the furor the broadcast had caused, he contacted the Foreign Office through the Swiss Embassy in Berlin to explain his actions and attempt to return home via neutral countries, but the German authorities refused to let him leave. In Performing Fleas, a 1953 collection of letters, Wodehouse wrote, "Of course I ought to have had the sense to see that it was a loony thing to do to use German radio for even the most harmless stuff, but I didn't. I suppose prison life saps the intellect." The reaction in America was mixed. The left-leaning publication PM accused Wodehouse of playing Jeeves to the Nazis, but the Department of War used the interview as an ideal representation of anti-Nazi propaganda. The Wodehouses remained in Germany until September 1943, when, because of the Allied bombings, they were allowed to move back to Paris. They were living there when the city was liberated on August 25, 1944. Wodehouse reported to the American authorities the following day, asking them to inform the British of his whereabouts. He was subsequently visited by Malcolm Muggeridge, recently arrived in Paris as an intelligence officer with MI6. The young officer quickly came to like Wodehouse and considered the question of treasonable behavior as ludicrous. He summed up the writer as ill-fitted to live in an age of ideological conflict. On September 9th, Wodehouse was visited by an MI5 officer and former barrister, Major Edward Koskin, who formerly investigated him, a process that stretched over 4 days. On September 28th, Koskin filed his report, which stated that in regards to the broadcast, Wodehouse's behavior had been unwise, but advised against further action. On November 23rd, Theobald Matthew, the director of public prosecutions, decided there was no evidence to justify prosecuting Wodehouse. In November 1944, Duff Cooper was appointed British ambassador to France, and he provided accommodations at the Hotel La Bristol, where the Wodehouses were living. Cooper complained to the French authorities, and the couple were moved to a different hotel. The Wodehouses were subsequently arrested by French police and placed under preventative detention despite no charges being pressed. When Muggeridge tracked them down later, he managed to get Ethel released straight away, and 4 days later assured that the French authorities declared Wodehouse unwell and put him in a nearby hospital, which was more comfortable than where they had been detained. While in the hospital, Wodehouse worked on his novel Uncle Dynamite. While still detained by the French, Wodehouse was again mentioned in questions in the House of Commons in December 1944, when MPs wondered if the French authorities could repatriate him to stand trial. Eden stated that the matter has been gone into, and according to advice given, there are no grounds upon which we could take action. 2 months later, Orwell wrote an essay in defense of P.G. Wodehouse, where he stated, "It is important to realize that the events of 1944 do not convict Wodehouse of anything worse than stupidity." Orwell's rationale was that Wodehouse's moral outlook has remained that of a public school boy, and according to the public school code, treachery in time of war is the most unforgivable of sins, which was compounded by his complete lack, so far as one can judge from his private works, of political awareness. On January 15th, 1945, the French authorities released Wodehouse, but they did not inform him until June 1946 that he would not face any official charges and was free to leave the country. Having secured American visas in July 1946, the Wodehouses made preparations to return to New York. They were delayed by Ethel's insistence on acquiring suitable new clothes and by Wodehouse's wishes to finish writing the novel The Mating Season in the peace of the French countryside. In April 1947, they sailed to New York, where Wodehouse was relieved at the friendly reception he received from the large press contingent awaiting his arrival. Ethel secured a comfortable penthouse apartment in Manhattan's Upper East Side, but Wodehouse was not at ease. The The New York that he had known before the war was much changed. The magazines that had paid lavishly for his stories were in decline, and those that remained were not much interested in him. He was sounded out about writing for Broadway, but he was not at home in the post-war theater. He had money problems with large sums temporarily tied up in Britain, and for the first time in his career he had no ideas for a new novel. He did not complete one until 1951. Wodehouse remained unsettled until he and Ethel left New York City for Long Island. Bolton and his wife lived in the prosperous hamlet of Remingsburg, part of the Southampton area of Long Island, 77 miles east of Manhattan. Wodehouse stayed with them frequently, and in 1952 he and Ethel bought a house nearby. They lived in Remingsburg for the rest of their lives. Between 1952 and 1975, he published more than 20 novels, as well as 2 collections of short stories, a heavily edited collection of his letters, a volume of memoirs, and a selection of his magazine articles. He continued to hunker out after a revival of his theatrical career. A 1959 off-Broadway revival of the 1917 Bolton Wodehouse Kern Leave It to Jane was a surprise hit, running for 928 performances, but his few post-war stage works, some in collaboration with Bolton, made little impression. Although Ethel made a return visit to England in 1948 to shop and visit family and friends, Wodehouse never left America after his arrival in 1947. It was not until 1965 that the British government indicated privately that he could return without fear of legal proceedings, and by then he felt too old to make the journey. But biographers Benny Green and Robert McCumb both take the view that this exile benefited Wodehouse's writing, helping him go on depicting the idealized England seen in his mind's eye rather than as it actually was in the post-war decades. During their years in Long Island, the couple often took in stray animals and contributed substantially to funds to a local animal shelter. In 1955, Wodehouse became an American citizen, although he remained a British subject, and was therefore still eligible for UK state honors. He was considered for an award of a knighthood 3 times from 1967, but the honor was twice blocked by British officials. In 1974, the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson intervened to secure a knighthood, KBE, for Wodehouse, which was announced in January 1975 New Year's honors list. The Times commented that Wodehouse's honor signaled official forgiveness for his wartime indiscretions. It is late, but not too late, to take the sting out of that unhappy incident. The following month, Wodehouse entered Southampton Hospital, Long Island, for treatment of a skin complaint. While there, he suffered a heart attack and died on February 14, 1975, at the age of 93. He was buried at Remingsburg Presbyterian Church 4 days later. Ethel outlived him by 9 years. Lenoria had preceded him, dying in 1944. And that was the Trivia Minute. And now, let's get back to the shows.